Hi everybody, welcome to another episode of Historia Politica Pública. In the episode of today, I will talk about the 20th centuries as a kind of introductory episode, how the different change of the end of the 19th century shaped the future decades, how the advance in technology and also in the different ideas that were spreading across the world had a deep influence in the World War I, World War II, and other kind of events. Obviously, nowadays we tend to remember the 20th century as the century of the two world wars, which with its deadly toll, it makes easily to remember. There were millions who were killed in both conflicts, millions who were displaced, and the world changed forever. However, it has always been a common idea, at least in Western Europe, that the World War One, World War II has been taught through a kind of Eurocentric approach. But here I want to go a bit further and talk how the different change in different parts of the world shape our understanding. First of all, one of the most important aspects of the era was the hurricane of change, as Eric Hobsbawm, the British historian, pointed out. At the end of the 19th century, there were huge advances in technology. There were railway, the increase of food, the combustion engine, the atomic power, or the information age. All these kind of changes shaped the 20th century and made it one of the probably the most influential in our modern history. Consumer capitalism will also increase the interconnectivity between people from different parts of the world, but this also increased the inequalities, establishing the perfect framework for the working class to revolt against the elites. And as Rosa Luxemburg, the Marxist police, argue that the dynamism of capitalism will eventually become its downfall, because how can we cope to such an abundance when the elites still want the biggest piece of cake? Capitalism made buyers from their workers, but now that the wages are stagnant, they cannot buy. So this obviously shaped the 20th century. It seems that I was talking about today, right? When the upper class are producing a huge amount of consumer goods in order that the working class, who are the real producers, buy them, but because the decreasing of the life standards are making impossible for significant amount of the population to buy the consumer's good, the people on top cannot enrich themselves through the selling of these foods, and yet they can survive through the inversions, the interest that they have in different parts of the world, the speculation through the buildings and so on. So nowadays there is a kind of parasitical upper class who is not even producing anything. Something similar that has been happening in the last 200 years, but now those people do not even put money into infrastructures in order to have new advances in technology, but rather just to enrich themselves. And this is something that in the 1920s Rosa Luxemburg was already denouncing. The thing is, according to Keynes, who was one of the intellectuals of that time, maintaining and sustaining markets was the only way to make capitalism survive. And it was precisely John Maynard Keynes who invented this idea of a Keynesianism for his surname, in which for him a perfect society will be that one in which every person worked, pay their taxes, at the same time had enough money to consume, and the economic cycle could still be going on all the time. Nowadays this is not the case, because again the working class is not able to afford the means of consumption. The 20th century also saw the death of the peasantry. It saw how Britain has consolidated itself as the empire. In the 19th century they destroyed China through the Opium Wars, but also they kept their colonies strong in Africa, in Asia. Obviously, the case in India is the most common, but the Commonwealth was spread across all the continents. There was also the communist ideology, which had a great influence in the working class movement over the world, the environmental impact, and so on. And within that paradigm, there were two historical writers who analyzed at the beginning of the century how these changes were shaping the world. One of those was Benoy Kumar Sarkar, who later on became one of the defensors of fascism in Asia. He saw fascism as a new ideology that could overthrow capitalism and colonialism in the Eastern world, which obviously they were interlinked, as Leon Trotsky saw in the 19th century, 20th century, how imperialism, capitalism was just the last stage of imperialism, because imperialism meant to achieve by force the hegemony of territories, create their own markets in order to benefit the upper class in the settler country. In that sense, Benoy Kumar Sarkar, written in 1918, mentioned something very, very interesting. He pointed out this was a year at the end of the First World War and the years after the Russian Revolution, so a huge turmoil was spreading over the world. He pointed that the argument against the Western notion of superiority towards the Oriental world was something common since 2000 years ago. He pointed out how Persia, during the years before Christ, was considered as the foreign, strange country full of weird people and so on. Then you have the Muslims, the Mongols, and so on. And he uses the example of the capture of Constantinople by the Turks in 1453, how the Turkish Empire was powerful until 1699, and how the Holy League in Europe resists any further advance of the Muslims. Also, this shaped somehow the idea of Europe, how those kind of powers always try to find the foreign as an enemy, which was, again, the Persians, the Muslims, and in the 20th century that was the Russians. Europe, which according to Hosborn and many other intellectuals is an abstract idea, because Europe has just formed ideologically by the interests of the powerful in different areas. For example, Europe before used to refer just to Western Europe until the fall of the Berlin Wall, when the Eastern Europe started to be studied more in the American universities and so on. The memory of superiority, according to Benoy Kumar Sarkar, is a potent factor in Asians' modern consciousness. Western thought, for Homer's Iliad, in which there was woman servility, despotism with leaders, the greediness, difficulty to cooperate, subjection of women, and so on, it is something common in the literature of the Western world. And this is something that Sarkar denounced fiercely, and precisely for that he's a huge critic of the Western world, which he saw how it was colonizing all the area of the world. Men of science have always taken an Orientalist approach towards this, continues Sarkar. Also, philosophers portray Orient philosophy as inactive, pacifist, pessimist, such as Buddhism. This is something which still is prevalent nowadays. Buddhism, many people believe that it's a religion in which you just need to go to the forest, think, meditate, be quiet, and not make too much trouble in your society. Obviously, this can be weaponized for the elites in order to make people docile and continue with this idea which has been established in many intellectual circles that you need to find your happiness in yourself, your material conditions doesn't save your chances to be happy in the world, so just worry about yourself and try to be in harmony with the world. In other words, this helps to kind of manipulate the masses, which otherwise could be subversive to the injustice system, and make them their own guilty if they do not triumph in society according what is triumphing capitalism. In that sense, as Sarkar point out, and to everybody that has read at least a bit about Buddhism, Buddhism is not an inactive kind of political ideology or religion. On the contrary, Buddhism has always been very active in political affairs, has tried to change the societies through their own ideology of cooperation, mutual aid, solidarity and so on. How in the times of Siddhartha Gautama there were hospitals that were built to take care of animals, or during the Vietnam War, how the Buddhist monks, they set fire on themselves, they immolate themselves in order to denounce the imperialist aggression of the United States against the Vietnamese people. So Buddhism and other Asian philosophies, as Sarkar pointed out, they are far from being passive. The only thing is that Europe has tried to westernize those ideologies in order to serve their own interests. Keeping with this article written by Sarkar, which by the way is called The Futurism of Young Asia, which by the way he pointed out how the year 1905 demonstrated that the Asian civilization, according to the standards of Europe, was not far behind from them. And this was clearly seen when Japan, which basically started to be industrialized in the 1870s, destroyed Russia, the Russian Empire, in 1905 in the war between Japan and Russia. This was an important part of the war. In that sense, for him, even though Japan was a feudal society with the samurai and made the transition in a kind of shift way, could easily compete with the European powers. He puts also the example of China as an open country until they closed themselves for political necessity, due to the intrigues and aggression of foreigners, such as the Opium War, how the British intoxicate literally the population of China in order to destroy one empire that was very powerful at that time, and the British wanted to eliminate all their enemies. In that sense, he points how the American enclosure in 1917 with the Red Scare and the stop to immigration was much harder than the one in China. But the thing is, the use of the Orientalist term, it was something common in the Western world, how the West compared Oriental superstition against its own rationality, the smoking the other's lifestyle, was compared their new custom with their adversary old, giving an image of decadent Orient. Against the idea that climate made the West superiorities, barbarity reigned in Europe until modern times, as precisely it is Sarkar who pointed out. It was how only from 1871 capital punishment was restricted to the offense of murder, treason and piracy in Europe. And in fact, in 1871, in Paris, in France, probably the most advanced country in Europe according to social rights, experienced a huge massacre against the communards. The people who had established the Paris Commune, where over 30,000 were killed and over 60,000 were in prison, and many others were forced to exiles. In that sense, Japan adapting to the West to be seen as an equal of Western world is a kind of effect of Europe and the Western world into the Asian societies. Occidentalization was used at the time by Japanese elites to distance themselves from the Asian notions. So this is a big problem, right? Because Sarkar pointed out how Europe was following a murderous approach, capitalism and imperialism, in order to perpetuate their power over the world alongside the United States. And in Asia, the only nation who was able to follow the steps of the European and even defeat one European power, such as Japan in the Japanese-Russian War, was following the steps of Western Europe. And in fact, in future years, Japan will conquer China, will conquer Korea, creating a system of repression in those areas that was not far enough of the worst crimes committed in Europe. And in fact, Japan will become an ally of Italy and Germany in World War II. So this is a kind of foreshadow of catalysm, because right in 1918, what the author plea is for peace between nations, although admitting that the arbitrament of the sword is inevitable. This is very important because when he published this article, The Futurism of Young Asia, there was the end of World War I. A year later will be the Treaty of Versailles. There will be the reunion of all the worldwide powers in order to establish the new kind of society. And it is precisely in these meetings that Japan demand to have an equal proportion of vote, of equal representation to the so-called third world. But the European powers and the United States reject this claim. They believe that the Western world, led by the white elites, had superiority over the barbaric nations over the world. In that sense, Japan obviously was frustrated upon this idea of Europe, and this saw a kind of distance between the Western world and what is now called the Global South, but at the time was called the Third World. Unfortunately, this only see how in years later will have consequences, how the interwar period of in Europe will cause devastation, and how this set the road to the World War II. But just to finish this introduction to the 20th century, in which I have based part of my episode in the article written by Sarkar, this is important also to remember how the old war of 19th century was in crisis, how were demonstrations in the Republic of Ireland, which was a British colony, in the United States, in France, in Germany, and so on. How the defeat of the powers in World War I, Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, had a catalyst effect in the whole Europe, creating a group of nations, which obviously, coming from the empire, made that many of those people had to migrate to other parts. The seed of fascism was growing on in those years, and it was precisely Hitler and Mussolini, two of the most prominent ideologists, defenders of fascism, fought in the wars and became radicalized after that. In that sense, apart from Benoit Kumar Sarkar article, I wanted to talk about Geoffrey Barraclough, which wrote the Introduction to Contemporary History in the same year, 1918. Again, it was an important date because it was the year after the Russian Revolution that shaped, influenced the world. Marxism was expanded ideologically to not just Europe, but also to Africa, Latin America, or Asia, and how the end of World War I changed the balance of powers in Europe. But I will talk about this in the next chapter because this one is getting quite long. So we'll focus next time on Geoffrey Barraclough, the Introduction to Contemporary History, and how the process of massive global transformation had a great influence of that. And just to finish, a last note about Benoit Kumar Sarkar. He was a professor of economics in University of Calcutta in India. He criticized the long-term Euro-American denigration of Asia. He imagined turning tables, Easterners treating Westerners as they have been treated, and focused on rupture, on rapid modernization, which also is part of allied to Nazi Germany, fascism as hope for India. So in that sense, the problem of Sarkar is that eventually he allied with Nazi Germany, and obviously his ideas that were very interesting because he demanded a kind of a place for Asia over a European westernized world could have a great influence. Unfortunately, far from following the steps of other philosophers, writers, and influencers, political figures of that time in Asia, such as obviously Gandhi is the best example. He provided another one that was following fascism, and eventually his text can be a bit controversial right now, but I suggest to read him through the lens of the aftermath of World War I and the Russian Revolution.